12s. We are going to look at an essay question today. I'm not physically doing an essay with you today. This lesson will continue over 2 days. I am just going to cover the theory in today's lesson. The essay question will be to compare and contrast two different market structures. All right, so we're going to basically do a comparison between the different market structures. Okay, so when we refer to the concept of a market structure, we are talking about the main characteristics of the market in which that individual producer will sell their products. So anytime that you see a question about the market structure, what they're asking is the characteristics of that market. Okay, they're not going to discuss the characteristics of the perfect market. They're going to say, examine the market structure of perfect competition. Okay, for example. So you must know if they refer to market structure, they are really talking about the characteristics of that market. Now, when we look at the market structure, it takes into account different factors that is going to determine how buyers and sellers will interact with each other in this market. Okay, so for example, it's going to look at how many buyers and how many sellers are there in this market. What is the nature of the product in this market? All right, so they're going to look at the different factors, a long list of factors that is different for each of the market structures. Now, we distinguish between either having perfect markets or we are going to have imperfect markets. Competition is either perfect or competition is imperfect. All right. Now, in this chapter that we are busy with now, we are basically focusing on the perfect market, perfect competition. When we go to the imperfect competition, that'll be in the next chapter. But we are going to do the market structures of these different markets in today's lesson because it is all revision. You did this exact same essay last year. The same trick I'm going to give you in tomorrow's lesson is the same as last year. Obviously, this year we are just doing it in a bit more detail. Okay, you'll see there's a few more headings in this table that we're going to do now compared to with what you had last year. All right. Now, when we talk about perfect competition means that there's many buyers and many sellers who are all price takers. Now, we said in the perfect market, we already did the characteristics of the perfect market the other day. We said in a perfect market, there's many sellers, so many sellers that each one's market share is minute and no single producer have any influence on the price. Therefore, they are price takers. And then we also said that in the perfect market, each individual producer sells an identical product. All right. So perfect competition. Remember, competition means there's lots of competition. Perfect competition means there's like unlimited competition. There are no limitations on the actions of buyers and sellers. So many sellers. When we talk about imperfect competition, that happens when the conditions for perfect competition are not met. Okay, so in actual fact, for a market to be classified as a perfect market, every single condition for the existence of perfect competition have to be met. And remember, I did say in the previous lesson that perfect competition in the real world doesn't exist, okay? Because that long list of conditions, there's not a single market that ticks all of those boxes. All right, so all markets in reality is actually examples of imperfect competition, some variants of imperfect competition. All right, so we said that where there's perfect competition, the price will be a true reflection of the scarcity of goods and services, which means basically that your price is determined by demand and supply only. In imperfect markets, something happens that interferes with demand and supply. So when the price is formed, 1 or 2 or 3 people have undue influence on that price, and it is not purely a combination of demand and supply, for example, that will determine the price. There can be government interference, there can be collusion and price fixing, okay? But something happens, which means that the price that exists for the product is not determined purely by demand and supply, then it is imperfect competition. Okay, so if we look at the different characteristics now, I'm going to look at the feature. Now, these will be your headings in your essay question, and then I'm going to refer to each and every market structure before we go to the next heading. All right, so the first characteristic that we are looking at is the number of sellers. All right, now we already said that in the perfect market, there are many sellers, many buyers and many sellers. And there are so many sellers that it is impossible for a single seller to influence the price through his actions. In a monopoly, and we are still going to do these three imperfect markets in detail in the next chapter, but the monopoly is basically the polar opposite of the perfect market. Where the perfect market have many sellers, in a monopoly, there is literally only one seller. All right, so there's one seller only, and obviously because there is only one seller, he will have a considerable amount of control over the price. When we get to monopolistic competition, remember from last year, monopolistic competition is basically a hybrid market structure, which is a combination of the perfect market and the monopoly. All right, so perfect competition and monopoly. So the combination of that gives us monopolistic competition. All right, so it has some characteristics that is similar to the perfect market, and in some ways it will be more similar to the monopoly. Okay, in terms of the number of sellers, for monopolistic competition, there's many sellers in exactly the same way as the perfect market. Okay, many sellers, and each of them again is very insignificant, controls a very small part of the market share. Market share is very small, and each business thinks that others will not detect its actions. In terms of the oligopoly, there's a few large sellers. They are interdependent. We did do this last year, but I will explain that in chapter 7 again. Okay, a few large sellers that are interdependent, but a few large sellers that dominates the market. All right, and in the oligopoly, they are constantly watching what their competitors are doing. All right, that's what that interdependency means. My actions depends on what I think my competitor is going to do. All right, so in a perfect market, many sellers. In a monopoly, literally only one. In a monopolistic competition, many sellers, and in an oligopoly, a few large sellers that will dominate the market. Right, in terms of control over the price, you will see that there's a correlation between how many sellers there are and then the amount of control that they have over the price in that market structure. In a perfect market, we said already last week that each individual producer has no control over the market whatsoever. Each individual producer is a price taker. They have no control over the price because there are so many of them, and each one's control or the market share is so small that it doesn't matter what they do, they cannot change the price. In a monopoly, because there is literally only one seller, the monopoly is called the price maker. Okay, so if a perfect market is a price taker because they have no control over the price, in a monopoly we say they are a price maker. Very important, you can never say that the monopoly has total control over the price. We are not saying that because the price is still determined by demand and supply, but the monopoly controls supply. He has no control over demand, however. All right, but he is a price maker because by changing his supply, he is able to change the price. For monopolistic competition, you will see when we discuss this, there is some control, all right? But we will qualify this when we actually do monopolistic competition, all right? Because they sell differentiated products, they have some control over their own product, but there is no market price as such in the monopolistic competition. In an oligopoly, they also have considerable control, obviously not as much as a monopoly. They have more control than the perfect market, but less control than a monopoly. But they have a large amount of control over the price. They have control. They can change the price if they so wish. The nature of the product in a perfect market, we already said, It is homogeneous. In other words, products are 100% identical and they are perfect substitutes for each other. Okay, so it doesn't matter which producer you are buying from. Each individual producer's products will be 100% identical, exactly the same. In the monopoly, the nature of the product is unique. Okay, in other words, there is no substitutes. Okay, the product is unique, which means it is special. It cannot be replicated. Nothing else like it exists. Nothing that can be even close to it exists in the market. So you cannot substitute it with anything else. You either have to buy the product from the monopoly or you have to learn to live without it. But there's no substitutes. For monopolistic competition, the products are differentiated. All right. So basically what this means is that products will be substitutes for each other. Okay, it will be substituted for each other. So in other words, it satisfies the same need, but they are not exactly the same. All right, they are differentiated, which means they are different. There's differences in quality or design or ingredients or whatever the case may be. They're not 100% identical. They are different. Each product is different. In an oligopoly, your products can be homogeneous or it can be differentiated. All right. If your products are homogeneous, identical, it is called a pure oligopoly. If they sell a differentiated product, it will be known as a differentiated oligopoly. All right, but here your products can be identical or they can be differentiated. In terms of entry and exit, we already said in the perfect market, there's complete freedom of entry and exit. There's absolutely no barriers to entry. So anybody that wants to enter the industry is free to do so. And everybody that makes losses is free to leave the industry to go and make an investment elsewhere. In the case of a monopoly, there is only one producer. Why? Because entry is blocked. All right. Entry is completely 100% blocked. It is impossible for anybody else to enter this industry. All right, so there's lots and lots of barriers to entry. It can be artificial, can be natural. We will look at that at the next chapter. But entry is completely blocked. It is impossible for anybody to enter into this industry. For monopolistic competition, again, it is relatively free. There's no physical barriers to entry. Okay, there could be natural reasons why people can't enter the market, but it is relatively free. Now, there's nothing preventing people from entering this market. In an oligopoly, also there is limited entry because there will also be barriers to entry. Now, there's a reason why there's only a few large producers in this market, because there are barriers to entry, which again can also be natural or artificial barriers to entry. But there's something in place that is preventing people from entering this market. In terms of collusion, okay, I did explain collusion when we did the characteristics of the perfect market. Remember, collusion is when businesses that are supposed to be competing with one another start cooperating with one another instead. They get together and they do price fixing. They discuss between themselves what they're going to do in terms of their quantities and how they would like to push prices up or down. Now, in a perfect market, we said that collusion is impossible. There's no secret communication between different producers. Sellers hardly even notice each other. Remember, we said in a perfect market, there's many sellers. It is impossible for the market to get all the sellers together so that they can now communicate and take action. It is impossible to get them all together. There's too many of them. It is impossible for all of them to agree on something. There's too many of them. So collusion does not take place in the perfect market. In a monopoly, there is also no collusion because there is only one seller. There's nobody for him to collude with. All right, who's he supposed to collude with? The voice is in his head. All right, there's no collusion in the monopoly because there is literally only one seller. In terms of monopolistic competition, also collusion is impossible for the same reason as the perfect market. For monopolistic competition, there's also a large number of sellers, so collusion will be impossible. because it is impossible to get all the sellers together at the same place, and even more impossible to get them all to agree on something. So literally, the only market structure where collusion actually happens is in the oligopoly. All right. In a data response question, if you see that the topic there is collusion and they ask you what market structure is depicted in this cartoon, your answer is always going to be the oligopoly. It is the only market structure where collusion is possible, and it does happen once in a while, even though it is illegal. Again, we did collusion in grade 11, and we will do it in detail again when we go to the theory of the oligopoly in chapter 7. The next characteristic is in terms of information. Right. In the perfect market, we already said that there's perfect and complete information that is made available to all the buyers and all the sellers. We said there's an effective communication system. All buyers and all sellers have all the relevant market information. They know exactly where the product is being sold. They know what the price is supposed to be. They know what the quality is supposed to be. Perfect and complete information is made available. In a monopoly, also, information is complete. There is only one producer, so obviously he has all the relevant information, and consumers will also be given all the relevant information. In monopolistic competition, same thing. There is perfect information. All buyers and all sellers will have all the necessary information regarding market conditions. Again, the only market structure where information is incomplete is in the oligopoly. All right, which is why they collude, because of the uncertainty, because of the incompleteness of the information and the uncertainty that goes along with that. That is why producers start colluding, to remove some of that uncertainty. All right, so the only market structure where information is lacking is the oligopoly. If we look at the shape of the demand curve in the perfect market, we have already seen that the individual producer will have a horizontal demand curve, a perfectly elastic demand curve at the level of the market price. His demand curve is horizontal because he is a price taker. He cannot change the price. For the monopoly, he will have a negatively sloping demand curve because he is the only producer. And because he is the only producer, his demand curve is also the demand curve for the industry, for the market. And the market demand curve always has a negative slope. All right, so in the monopoly, it is a negatively sloping demand curve and it is relatively inelastic. So where the perfect market is perfectly elastic, for the monopoly, it is negatively sloping but relatively inelastic. Okay, it is inelastic because there are no substitutes. All right, I will explain that when we get to the monopoly. For monopolistic competition, each producer will have its own negatively sloping demand curve. Remember, I said in monopolistic competition, the products are differentiated. So there is no market and individual. Each individual producer will have his own negatively sloping demand curve for his differentiated product. And that demand curve will be relatively elastic because lots of substitutes are available. Okay, so if there's no substitutes, like in the monopoly, the graph is still negatively sloping, but it is inelastic. Whereas with the monopolistic competition, it is negatively sloping, but elastic because there are substitutes available. For the oligopoly, you will remember from last year that it has a kinked demand curve. Okay, so it's broken basically. The top half of this kinked demand curve, both parts, is negatively sloping. Okay, it is kinked, yes, but both parts of this kinked demand curve is still negatively sloping. The top half is just relatively elastic. Okay, so it's got a flatter slope basically. And the bottom half is relatively inelastic, so it is a steeper graph. Again, I am going to explain the kinked demand curve in chapter 7 because it's very important. although you should know this because we did do this last year in detail. If we look at the long run profits, okay, again, after we have actually done the calculations at the end of this chapter, I'm going to tell you what is the difference between economic profit, normal profit, and economic loss. So you are not 100% going to understand this now, although we did do this last year also. Okay, but I will expand on this later on in this chapter. Just for now, you need to know that for the perfect market, in the short run, an economic profit or a normal profit or an economic loss can be made in the short run by the individual producer. Our focus is on the individual producer now, okay? So in the short run, there's three possibilities, either economic profit or normal profit or economic loss. But in the perfect market, only normal profits can be made in the long run. For the monopoly, economic profits are possible in the short run and the long run. The monopoly can make a normal profit and it can make an economic loss also, but it is unlikely. All right, I know in our country the parastatals are proving us wrong. Eskom is a monopoly. Eskom is running at a loss, constant loss, okay? But that is the exception to the rule. In theory, a monopoly should be making an economic profit in the short run and in the long run. Monopolistic competition works the same as the perfect market. In the short run, economic profit, normal profit, or economic loss can be made, but in the long run, a normal profit only. And then lastly, in the oligopoly, economic profits should be made in theory in the short run as well as the long run. Okay, now an easy way to remember this now is to see that, remember, in the perfect market and in monopolistic competition, there is freedom of entry and exit. It is exactly that freedom of entry and exit that is stopping them from making an economic profit in the long run. So any market structure, like perfect market, like monopolistic competition, where there's freedom of entry and exit, only normal profits will be made in the long run. All right, with your monopoly and your oligopoly, we said that there are barriers to entry. All right, so there's no freedom of entry, and that is why they are able to make an economic profit also in the long run. Right, we're almost finished. If we look at allocative efficiency, again, you are not going to understand this now. I am going to explain this to you when we are doing the graphs. Like straight after this, we are basically going to start with the graphs. Okay, so just study the theory for now. You will understand better when I've actually done the graphs. Okay, now how we see whether a market is allocatively efficient or not. Okay, remember allocative efficiency in grade 10, when you were in grade 10, you spoke about allocative efficiency and productive efficiency in terms of the production possibilities curve. Okay, we are still going to link it to that, okay, but we're going to look at it from a different perspective as well. All right, in the short run, or when we have to decide if a market is allocatively efficient, we are literally going to look at their price and the marginal cost. But we want to know what is the price and the marginal cost at the point where the business chooses to produce. And that will be where they maximize their profit. Okay? So at the profit maximization point, we're going to look at the price and we look at the marginal cost. If your price and your marginal cost is equal, then we are going to say that allocative efficiency have been achieved. All right. Now for the perfect market, your individual producer is allocatively efficient both in the short run and in the long run, because when they maximize their profits, the price and the marginal cost will always be equal. It is only the perfect market that in the short run and the long run will be allocatively efficient. Allocative efficiency basically means that the market is producing enough goods and services to satisfy most of people's needs, and the product mix is what the consumers actually want, okay? So the supply basically is meeting the tastes and preferences and the demand or whatever of the consumers. All right, so it is literally only in the perfect market where allocative efficiency is achieved, and it is achieved in both the short run and the long run. All right, we have spoken before, I think, about Pareto efficiency. Okay, remember Pareto efficiency means when we are in a situation and one person cannot be made better off without making someone else worse off. Okay, remember I still said Pareto efficiency is not about fairness. It's got nothing to do with being fair. Okay, if Pity has all the money in the world and Sunny has no money, okay, that is Pareto efficiency, because I cannot improve Sunny's situation without taking money away from Pity to make her better. So Pity has to be made worse off in order to improve it for Sunny. Okay, that is Pareto efficiency. But we are going to talk about this again in chapter 8. All right, for the monopoly, in terms of allocative efficiency, the price where products are maximized, now where profits are maximized for the monopoly, the price is always going to be higher than the marginal cost. Okay, that's what we are looking for. And that means that the cost is higher. Now, the price is higher than what it actually costs. All right. So it means that the product is under-consumed. We're not producing enough of these goods, so there will be consumer needs that will not be satisfied. All right. So it's not allocatively efficient because price is higher than marginal cost. Same for monopolistic competition, okay? In monopolistic competition also, the goods are priced higher than the marginal cost. So because the price is higher than the marginal cost, again, there will be underproduction. Not enough goods are being produced to satisfy everybody's needs. We are producing below capacity. Exactly the same also for the oligopoly. There is no allocative efficiency because the price is higher than the marginal cost. Same thing. We are not producing enough to satisfy everybody's needs. Okay, when we go to technical efficiency, it is called technical efficiency or productive efficiency. Okay, now how do we know if a business is technically efficient? Again, we have to look at profit maximization point. When the business is producing profit maximizing output, if he is producing at the lowest point of the average cost curve, so in other words, he is efficient, he's producing at the lowest cost possible, then we are going to say that that market is technically or productively efficient. Okay, so when you have your equilibrium output, your profit maximizing output, and at that point, you are producing at the lowest point, your average cost is as low as what it can be, then you are technically efficient. Okay, now in the perfect market, the individual producer is not productively efficient in the short run, but he is technically efficient in the long run. And again, I'm going to show this to you on the graphs when we do the graphs. Okay, so you'll understand this better when you actually have the graph in front of you and you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, but the perfect market is productively efficient only in the long run, not in the short run. Okay, the monopoly is never productively efficient. It's productively inefficient because he is not producing at the lowest point of the average cost curve. All right, same for monopolistic competition and same for the oligopoly. All right, it is only the perfect market and only in the long run that achieves productive efficiency. The monopoly, monopolistic competition, and the oligopoly, when they maximize their profits, they are not producing where average cost is at its lowest, so they are inefficient. Okay, when we make a comparison of the prices in the different market structures, in the perfect market, we already said that the price is determined by demand and supply only. All right, so literally, the price is determined by demand and supply only. There is no interference and no individual person has an influence over this price. And the perfect market is the market structure that gives us the lowest price. All right, it's the market structure that has the lowest prices. For the monopoly the price is determined by the monopoly's supply curve, because remember, the monopoly is the only one in the market, so he controls the supply curve. So the monopolist's supply curve and the market demand curve will determine the price. Okay, remember I said the monopoly doesn't have full control over the price because he cannot control demand. All right, but he does control supply. So if he increases or decreases his supply because the demand curve is negative, he can change the price. And out of all the market structures, the monopoly is the market structure that has the highest prices, because he has the more price control than in any other market. In monopolistic competition, the price is also relatively high. Remember, we said each individual producer has control over his differentiated products supply. Okay, so there will be a different price for each differentiated product. And the price will also be relatively high. The price in this case will be higher than in the perfect market, but lower than the monopoly. Right, in the oligopoly, prices are also relatively high, especially if collusion takes place, because if they collude, normally what they do is they push prices up. All right, so when you work in an oligopoly, obviously, because of price control, they have a large amount of control there. There's a few large sellers that actually dominate the prices. So the price will be relatively high, but in the oligopoly, they don't like to change prices. We did say that they have price control. They have a considerable amount of control over the price. But in an oligopoly, because of that kinked demand curve, they don't like to change the prices. So generally price rigidity, that means the price generally stays the same. Like to change the prices. Okay. In terms of the output, for the perfect market, because there's many sellers, obviously there's a high output. Each seller sells biki, and if we add all those biki together, it ends up being a lot. So it's a high output. Consumers have a large variety to choose from. And again, it is the market structure with the highest output. So in the perfect market, they give us the highest output at the lowest price. In the monopoly, the output is limited to what the monopolist is willing to offer. All right, so if the monopolist decides to decrease his supply so that he can push up the prices, output can be very, very low. All right, there's only one seller, so what is available on the market is limited to what that one seller is willing to offer for sale. And because there are no substitutes, there's obviously no choices. Consumers don't have different choices. There's no variety for the consumers to choose from. All right. Monopolistic competition. Again, the output is relatively high. Again, because there's many sellers. And each individual seller sells biki. We put the biki together and we have a high level of output. In the oligopoly, the output is low. Again, because there is only a few large sellers and there's little choice. All right, in monopolistic competition, there's lots and lots of different things to choose from. Lots of different differentiated products to choose from. Whereas in the oligopoly, there's little choice. There's only a few large sellers, so there's a few variants of that product that people can choose from. So the highest output will be from the perfect market. The lowest will be from the monopoly. All right, second lowest oligopoly. All right, last thing, if you have to give examples. Okay, the perfect markets we already said, the Johannesburg Securities Exchange, the foreign exchange markets, and some of the agricultural produce markets. For monopoly, now most of the monopolies that we are going to give as examples is near monopolies. Now, they're not true monopolies, but I will discuss that with you in the next chapter. So we can use Eskom as an example and De Beers. For monopolistic competition, you will see clothing and shoe industries. They fall under monopolistic competition, as well as your service industries. Hairdressers, restaurants, doctors, pharmacies, it's service industries. And then in your oligopoly industry, oil and cement industries, your washing powders, cars, different makes of cars, different makes of cell phone service providers, bread, milk industries, all of them are examples of oligopoly markets. Right, so as I said, tomorrow We are going to continue this lesson when I'm going to do an example essay with you. Today we just went through the theory, so you can go through the theory, make sure you're on the same page as me. Tomorrow we are going to actually physically do an essay question based on this information.